Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. There are stories sailors don't write down, not because they forgot, but because they saw something they couldn't explain. Stories about a southern sea that felt wrong, about a wall of ice that didn't look natural, and about a captain who went beyond it and realized he hadn't discovered anything new. He'd entered something that already knew he was there. Tonight, we follow that story, the ice wall, a hidden passage, and what might exist beyond the edge of the map. So, before we begin, ask yourself this. If something out there was watching, would you even know? Chapter 1. Captain William Morris and the Rumour of the Southern Sea. Captain William Morris was not a man easily satisfied by finished maps. He had seen too much of the world to believe it ended neatly where ink stopped. War had taught him that certainty was often just a story told loudly enough to be believed, and the sea had taught him something quieter, that the edges of things were rarely where people claimed they were. When he returned from his last long voyage, those who knew him noticed the change. Not dramatic, not spoken, just a subtle dislocation, as though part of him had remained somewhere beyond the horizon, and the rest had come back without it. He spent his evenings in places most men avoided, low-lit taverns near the docks, tables where conversations trailed off when strangers approached, rooms where the air carried the smell of salt, oil, and unfinished stories. And in those places, he began to hear it. Not a single account, not a clear claim. Fragments. A helmsman who spoke of a horizon that did not lie flat, but rose. A whaler who insisted the Southern Sea did not end in ice, but in something that resembled a boundary. A navigator who stopped mid-sentence and refused to continue, no matter how much he was paid. None of them agreed, but they all shared one detail. They had seen something and chosen not to go back. Most men dismissed such talk as fatigue, exaggeration, or the slow unravelling that long voyages sometimes bring. But Morris did something different. He listened. And once he listened, he began to notice something else. The stories did not spread outward. They stayed contained, passed carefully, repeated selectively, almost as if they were not meant to travel too far. That was the moment the rumour changed for him. It was no longer just a story about the South. It became a question. Not what is there, but why does no one speak about it openly? Chapter 2. The secret map no one was meant to see. Every story like this requires a turning point, something physical, something undeniable. For Morris, it arrived quietly. Not in a moment of revelation, but in the form of an object that should not have existed. The chart came to him in pieces of conflicting memory, depending on who told it. Some say he purchased it from a naval widow who did not know its value. Others claim it was handed to him by a man too frightened to keep it. A few insist it was never given at all, only found where it had no reason to be. But every version agrees on what mattered. The chart was wrong. Not obviously wrong, not crudely drawn or mistaken. It was precisely wrong. Along its southern edge, where most maps surrendered to blankness, there were corrections. Faint overlays beneath scraped ink. Coordinates that had been altered, then partially removed. Not erased completely, just enough to make them difficult to follow. There was a curve drawn there too. Not a coastline, not a current, a passage. And near it, markings that did not match any known cartographic system. Not navigational warnings, not depth indicators, not stars. They felt intentional, as if left by someone who expected the map to be found again. But not by everyone. Morris studied it for days, then weeks. At first, he tried to disprove it, compared it to known routes, measured inconsistencies, looked for the kind of errors that would expose it as a forgery. But the longer he studied it, the more one thought refused to leave. If this map was false, it was constructed with too much care. And if it was real, then someone had gone to considerable effort to make sure it did not remain so. Which led to the question that mattered more than the map itself. Why remove a route unless it leads somewhere you don't want found? Chapter 3. The crew that sailed toward Antarctica's ice wall. Morris did not announce his intentions. There was no grand departure, no public declaration, no attempt to frame the voyage as discovery. If anything, he made it appear ordinary. That was deliberate. because expeditions attract attention, and attention creates records. Instead, he assembled his crew quietly. Not the best men available, the right ones. A first mate who had sailed far enough south once before and never spoken of it again. A young stargazer whose curiosity outweighed his caution. A harpooner who trusted instinct over instruction. And a handful of sailors whose reasons for boarding were simple enough to avoid questions. Debt, loyalty, escape, restlessness. No one was told of the full purpose of the voyage, not even the officers. They were given a direction, not an explanation. Supplies were loaded in excess of what the journey seemed to require. Extra water, additional oil, reinforced rigging. Enough to sustain a voyage longer than any reasonable southern route would demand. Some of the crew noticed. But men at sea learn quickly which questions are worth asking and which are not. What they noticed more was Morris himself. The way he guarded the chart. The way he avoided unnecessary conversation. The way he looked south. Not occasionally, but constantly. As if he were not navigating toward something, but anticipating it. And when the ship finally departed, there were no cheers from the dock, no celebration. Only the quiet departure of a vessel that, whether anyone said it aloud or not, did not feel like it was going somewhere new. It felt like it was going somewhere known, but not spoken of. Chapter 4. The Last Known Waters. For a time, everything behaved as expected. The sea moved with familiar rhythm. Wind filled the sails with honest force. The stars held their positions. The world, though distant, remained predictable. Men settled into routine. Work, rest, small arguments, quiet laughter. It's important that this part of the story remains grounded, because without it, nothing that follows would feel as wrong as it does. The change did not arrive suddenly. It never does. It began with absence. The birds disappeared at first, gradually then completely. No explanation. No storm to drive them away, no visible shift in conditions, just fewer each day. Then came the silence. Not total, not unnatural at first, just thinner. The sea still moved, but without voice. Waves struck the hull, but the sound lacked depth. Even the wind, when it came, felt less like movement and more like pressure. The crew noticed. Not all at once, but enough. Men began to linger at the rails longer than necessary. Watches felt extended. Conversations shortened. It was not fear yet, not exactly. It was the beginning of awareness, that something had changed before anything had visibly changed at all. And Morris did not react with surprise. He watched, carefully, as though the absence of life, of sound, of normality was not unexpected, but confirmation. Chapter 5. Why the compass began to fail. The first undeniable break came with something no sailor ignores, the compass. At first it was subtle, a tremor in the needle, a hesitation before settling. Nothing alarming. Southern waters had always been difficult. Variations were expected. But this was not variation. This was inconsistency. The needle began to drift. Not wildly, not dramatically. Just enough that corrections no longer aligned. Morris recalculated, and then recalculated again. The readings refused to stabilize. By the second night, the problem had spread. Star positions, still visible through breaks in the cloud, felt misaligned. Not incorrect, not displaced enough to provoke immediate alarm, but wrong in a way that resisted explanation. The stargazer noticed first. He tried to articulate it, failed, then tried again. "The sky feels familiar," he said, "just not where it should be." The first mate dismissed it at first, but instruments do not lie easily. And by the third night, even the most grounded men aboard understood something simple. Their position could no longer be trusted, not by compass, not by sky, not by calculation. And this is where this story shifts, because when a sailor loses direction, he does not simply lose location, he loses reference. And when reference fails, the world stops behaving like a place and starts behaving like something else entirely. Morris stood at the helm longer than necessary, watching the needle, watching the horizon, watching something no one else could see yet. And if there was fear in him, it did not change his course, it only confirmed it. Chapter 6. The Silent Sea Before the Ice. The wind did not die, it withdrew. There is a difference sailors understand instinctively, even if they cannot explain it. A storm ends, a calm settles. Both belong to the natural rhythm of the sea. This did not. The sails slackened, but not with the softness of rest. They hung heavy, as if the air itself had thickened around them. The ocean flattened, not into calm, but into stillness so complete it felt imposed rather than earned. The ship moved, but without resistance. That was the first detail that troubled Morris. Water should push back. Even the gentlest sea carries weight, motion, friction. Here the hull seemed to glide, as though the ocean beneath them had become something smoother than water had any right to be. Sound followed, or rather the absence of it. No gulls, no distant breaks, no long, low groan of shifting current. Even the familiar language of wood and rope, creaks, strains, soft impacts, felt muted, reduced to something closer to memory than reality. Men began lowering their voices without instruction. A dropped tool rang too sharply, a laugh ended too quickly. Even footsteps softened, as though the deck itself resisted noise. One sailor muttered that the sea was listening. No one corrected him. Morris remained at the bow for hours, watching. Not for movement, but for interruption. Because by then he understood something the others had only begun to feel. This was not emptiness. It was the removal of everything unnecessary. And whatever remained was waiting. Chapter 7. The first sight of Antarctica's ice wall. It did not emerge gradually. It appeared. A line at first, too straight to be mistaken for cloud, too vertical to belong to the horizon. Then, as the fog shifted and the distance closed, it resolved into something no man aboard had prepared language for. A wall. Not metaphor, not exaggeration. A structure of ice rising sheer from the sea, its face fractured with deep blue veins, its surface catching light in a way that made it seem less like frozen water and more like something carved. It stretched beyond sight in both directions, endless, unbroken, unwelcoming. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some stood in silence, unable to process the scale. Others cursed under their breath. One man turned away entirely, as if refusing to look might restore the world to something manageable. The first mate spoke what many were already thinking. This is where we turn. Morris did not respond. He stepped forward, closer to the rail, studying the surface. Not in awe, but in assessment. That was what unsettled most of the crew. Not the wall itself, but the absence of surprise in the man who had led them there. Because to Morris, this was not discovery, it was confirmation. He ordered the ship to follow the barrier. Hour after hour, they sailed alongside it. The wall did not change, no breaks, no collapse, no sign that it ended or weakened, just continuity. A boundary that felt less like a natural formation and more like a line drawn with intent. And somewhere within that immensity, Morris believed there was something else. Not a flaw, a passage. Not something the ice had failed to close, but something it had been shaped to conceal. Chapter 8. The hidden passage beyond the ice wall. They nearly missed it, which in hindsight felt like part of the design. The wall did not open dramatically. There was no grand break, no visible gateway announcing itself. Only a subtle distortion in the line, a light inward curve, a darkness where the light behaved differently. The kind of detail a man would overlook unless he already knew it was there. Morris saw it first. He did not announce it. He adjusted course. The crew noticed the shift immediately. "What are you doing?" No answer. The ship moved closer. And that was when they felt it. Not seen, felt. A change in the water. Warmer. Not by degrees measurable with instruments, but enough for the body to recognize. The air carried it too, faint but undeniable. Impossible. The first mate stepped forward, voice tight. This isn't right. He wasn't talking about the temperature. He was talking about the implication. Because if the sea beyond the ice was different, then the ice was not just a boundary, it was separation. The opening revealed itself fully only at close range, a narrow breach, half hidden by fog, where the water pooled inward with slow, deliberate movement. Not turbulent, not chaotic, directed. As though something beyond it was drawing the sea through. The crew resisted. Voices rose. One man refused outright. Another crossed himself and stepped back from the rail. Morris gave the order. No speech, no explanation, just direction. The ship turned toward the opening, and as the hull crossed into its shadow, every man aboard understood something without needing it spoken. They had not found a way through, they had entered something. Chapter 9. Through the Gate of Frozen Mist. Inside, the world lost definition. Distance collapsed first. The bow vanished into fog that clung too closely, too evenly, too completely. The mast seemed disconnected from the deck. Men spoke and felt their voices absorbed before they travelled. Time followed, not stopped. Not distorted by any measurable sense, but weakened. Moments stretched without reason. Tasks felt longer than they should. Watches passed without the usual markers of progression. It was not disorientation, it was detachment. The ice walls, when visible, appeared suddenly. Vast pale surfaces sliding past the edges of perception, then disappearing again into the mist. Their scale could not be measured, their distance could not be trusted. Even light behaved differently. Lanterns burned smaller, dimmer, as though illumination itself resisted expansion. And then, the first anomaly above. It was subtle, a faint shift in the fog overhead. One man saw it as movement, another described it as a shadow that did not belong to any structure. A third insisted there was nothing at all. That disagreement mattered, because whatever it was, it did not present itself clearly enough to be agreed upon. Morris recorded it, not as a sighting, as a possibility, and beneath that, a line that would later become central to the story. This passage does not feel newly discovered. He paused before continuing. It feels maintained. And somewhere beyond the fog, something moved. Not toward them, not away, just with them. Chapter 10. The Watcher in the Sky. The lookout did not panic. That was what made it worse. He called down once, calm, controlled, then stopped mid-sentence. When the others reached the deck, they followed his line of sight. And for a moment, no one spoke. There are things the mind struggles to describe, not because they are complex, but because they do not behave in ways description can easily hold. This was one of them. A shape, not defined by edges, defined by absence, darker than the sky around it, yet not solid, present yet refusing to resolve into anything familiar, and within it, a faint, intermittent glow. Red. Not bright, not active, observational. The object did not descend, did not accelerate, did not announce itself. It matched their movement, silently, deliberately. There was no sound, no wind displacement, no indication of propulsion, which left only one conclusion the crew could not ignore. It was not affected by the same rules as everything else around them. Some called it a sign. Others refused to name it at all. One man turned away entirely and would not look again. Morris did not react outwardly, but he did something that revealed everything. He stopped watching the horizon and began watching it. Because in that moment, the nature of the voyage changed. They were no longer moving into the unknown. They were being observed within it. The object drifted, faded, returned, never fully leaving, never fully revealing itself, like an eye adjusting to darkness. And for a moment, just a moment, something else overlapped it. A second impression, not vast, not distant, closer. The shape didn't hold, but the mind tried to complete it anyway. A narrower form, elongated, too precise where the other was undefined. Then it was gone, as if the act of noticing it had been enough to remove it. And for the first time since the journey began, the crew understood something with complete clarity. This was not an accident, not a coincidence, not a phenomenon. Whatever lay beyond the ice was not unaware of them. Chapter 11. The Open Sea Beyond Antarctica. When the fog finally thinned, the crew expected something final. Ice, impact, the end of movement. Instead, they found open water. It spread before them in a wide, dark plain, calmer than any southern sea had a right to be. Not still in the way of calm weather, but controlled. The surface moved, but without the randomness sailors trusted. No chaotic chop, no broken rhythm, just long, slow undulations that seemed to repeat, as though the sea itself were following a pattern it did not need to deviate from. The ship cut forward through it, but even that felt muted. The wake did not scatter unnaturally. It folded back into the surface too cleanly, as if the disturbance here was temporary by design. Above them, the sky held steady. At first, nothing appeared wrong. The same stars, the same general arrangement. But the longer they looked, the more difficult it became to trust what they were seeing. Certain alignments held too precisely. Familiar constellations seemed slightly adjusted. Not moved exactly, just held in positions that felt too consistent, too exact. The young stargazer tried to correct it in his mind, then stopped trying, because whatever he was seeing was not drifting, it was fixed. Maurice stood at the rail, watching the horizon stretch outward into something that should not have existed. Beyond the Great Antarctic Barrier, where every map promised finality, there was continuation. A sea that behaved, a sky that held, a system that did not feel abandoned. And for the first time since entering the passage, a new thought settled in. They had not crossed into emptiness, they had crossed into something maintained. But it wasn't just the sea. The horizon didn't behave like distance anymore. It curved, but not away, around, as though the space beyond the ice was not an extension of the world, but a contained one. The stargazer noticed it first. "The sky doesn't open," he said quietly. "It closes." And for a moment, it felt less like they had crossed into another region and more like they had entered something else entirely. A world within a world. And then, quietly, the thought arrived. Not as theory, as correction. That the maps they had trusted were not incomplete. They were selective. Not showing the edge of the world, but the edge of what was permitted to be known. And beyond it was not emptiness, but scale. The kind of scale that does not extend outward, but surrounds. Or something larger seen from the inside. Chapter 12. The Shores That Should Not Exist. Land appeared first as a distortion, a dark interruption along the horizon where there should have been none. At first, it looked like distance, then shadow, then shape, and then structure. Cliffs rose, but not in the way cliffs should. Not broken, not jagged, not worn by time into randomness. These were continuous, long vertical faces that held their line far too long without deviation, as if erosion had been limited. As the light shifted, the details sharpened. Lines, not cracks, not fractures. Lines that held direction beyond what nature tends to allow. The ship drew closer, and the illusion of natural coastline began to fail. Edges appeared where there should have been slopes. Repetition emerged where there should have been variation. Sections of the shoreline seemed to mirror each other, not perfectly, but enough to suggest intention rather than coincidence. Then someone saw the lights. Small at first, then unmistakable. Fixed points along the dark surface, evenly spaced, but not evenly enough to feel comfortable. Not scattered like flame, not irregular like settlement, placed, deliberate. The first mate lowered his glass slowly, as though lowering it too quickly might confirm something he wasn't ready to accept. "If that's natural," he said quietly. No one answered. Because nature does not hold symmetry that carefully, and whatever they were approaching had been shaped. Maurice returned to the chart. For the first time, it made sense. Not as a map of where to go, but where not to. Certain markings pulsed in his memory now, not routes, boundaries. Zones that had been carefully avoided. And one region marked differently, not emphasized, not highlighted, but preserved. The first mate noticed his expression. "What is it?" Maurice hesitated, then answered quietly. "This isn't the only place. And this might be one of the few we were meant to reach. A place not just hidden, but kept. A region not discovered, but allowed. Safe." Chapter 13. Signs of a hidden civilization beyond the ice wall. As the ship moved closer to shore, the question of whether this place was inhabited disappeared. Not gradually, immediately. Because what revealed itself was not survival, it was structure. Terraces rose from the waterline in long, measured steps, not carved roughly into the land, but cut with a consistency that suggested calculation. Each level held its distance from the next with precision. Too consistent for erosion, too clean for accident. Long extensions reached into the water. At first they resembled docks, but the closer they came, the less sense they made. Some were too narrow to walk, others too wide to serve a clear purpose. Their spacing followed a pattern, but not one any of the crew could assign function to. The harpooner frowned as he studied them. "Too regular," he muttered, "but not for us." That was the detail that lingered. Everything here obeyed a logic, but it wasn't human logic. Surfaces met at angles that felt just slightly off expectation. Not wrong enough to reject, but wrong enough to resist familiarity. Pathways suggested direction, but didn't quite align with where a person would naturally go. Even the material itself behaved differently. Dark surfaces absorbed the daylight completely, swallowing it without reflection. But as the light faded, the same surfaces began to release a soft glow. Not bright, not illuminating, just enough to define edges. Not light for seeing, light for maintaining visibility. The place did not feel built for living. It felt calibrated, not for comfort, not for shelter, for function. Morris felt it before he understood it. Every line, every surface, every single angle of that shoreline carried the same quiet implication. This was not a place that had grown. It was a place that had been arranged. But not all of it matched. That was the detail that unsettled him. Some structures aligned perfectly, others didn't, as though they had been built at different times or by different intentions. The harpooner pointed toward a distant section of the terraces, farther inland. "That part's wrong," he said. "Not damaged, not unfinished, just different." The stargazer followed his gaze. "Not different," he whispered. "Older." Not just older in age, older in intention. The lines were heavier, more deliberate, less refined, as though they had been built at a time when precision was not the goal, but dominance. The harpooner felt it immediately. "This wasn't made to last," he said quietly. "It was made to hold something." No one asked what. And beyond it, further still, something else rose, faint, geometric. Not part of the city they were approaching, not abandoned, not active, just there, watching in a way the nearer structures did not. The stargazer spoke again, but softer now. They knew we were coming. No one asked how he could know that, because the longer they looked at the terraces, the less they felt like structures waiting to be discovered, and more like structures that had been waiting to be seen. Chapter 14. The Geometry That Watches Back. They did not anchor. No order was given. No discussion held. The ship simply slowed. As if approaching too close required permission no one believed they had. From the deck, the geometry of the shoreline became clearer and more unsettling. Nothing was random, but nothing was perfectly symmetrical either. It hovered in between, close enough to pattern that the mind tried to complete it, off enough that it never could. Rectangular formations stretched along the terraces, but their proportions resisted familiarity. Some were too long, others too shallow. A few seemed to taper at angles that made depth difficult to judge. Distance itself became unreliable. Structures that appeared near remained distant. Others that seemed far resolved too quickly. The navigator attempted to sketch what he saw. He stopped after the third attempt. "I can't hold it," he admitted. "It changes when I look away." The harpooner narrowed his eyes at the shoreline. "No," he said. "It doesn't change. We do." That was when they noticed the alignment. Certain edges, long uninterrupted lines built into the terraces, were not facing the sea. They were facing the ship. Not broadly, not approximately, exactly. No matter where the vessel drifted, those lines held their orientation, watching. Not tracking movement, but existing in a state that already accounted for it. The sky above remained fixed, the sea below remained controlled, and the land ahead observed. And then, something broke the pattern. Not in the structures, in perception. The navigator looked back at the sea, then back at the terraces. "We are not where we think we are." No one answered, because they had all felt it already. The ship had not moved closer, the shoreline had adjusted. Not physically, relationally, as though distance here was not fixed, but assigned. Chapter 15. The Silence That Responds. No sound came from the shore, no wind through structures, no movement across surfaces, no indication of life in any form the crew understood. And yet, the silence was not empty. It was responsive. The first sign was subtle, a shift in the glow along the terraces, not brighter, not dimmer, adjusted. As if the ship drifted slightly starboard. A faint line of light extended across one of the upper levels, just enough to redefine its edge. Then another, and another. Not illumination, acknowledgement. The crew did not speak, because speaking suddenly felt inappropriate, as though the sound itself might disrupt something that had already accounted for their presence. Morris stepped forward, just slightly. The glow shifted again. Not toward him, but with him. He froze. Every instinct told him the same thing at once. This place was not reacting in real time. It had already mapped every possible position he could take, and was selecting the version that matched. The stargazer dropped his tools. "They don't need to see us," he whispered. "They already—" He stopped. Because out along the highest terrace, one of the dark surfaces changed. Not opened, not moved, but redefined. And then something resolved. Not emerging, not stepping forward, resolving. Like an image coming into focus, except nothing had changed except their ability to perceive it. It had always been there. That was the part no one could process. Not hidden, not concealed, simply unrecognized. Its form resisted completion. The mind tried to assign edges, failed, tried again. And somewhere in that failure, awareness settled in. This was not a figure standing in a place. It was a point where the place itself was looking back. No features, no clear form. And yet, something about its proportions resisted familiarity. Not wrong, but not human. The suggestion of structure without symmetry. Too balanced in some places, too reduced in others. As though it had not been shaped by the same assumptions as the body. The kind of form the mind recognizes but cannot place. Just a presence defined by the absence of everything around it. And for the first time since crossing the passage, the crew understood something with absolute clarity. They had not discovered this place. They had entered it. And whatever maintained it had just acknowledged their arrival. Chapter 16. The Watcher returns above the hidden city. Night settled slowly over the shoreline. The city dimmed with it, not into darkness, but into something controlled. Light softened, movement reduced. Sound, if there had been any, disappeared entirely. And then it returned. Not dramatically, not announced. A faint red presence above the highest structures. Dim, controlled, precise. The crew saw it almost at the same moment. Not because it revealed itself, but because something in the city changed. Every figure stopped, every motion ceased. Not in panic, in recognition. High above, the shape moved. Not like a craft, not like anything bound to air or momentum. It drifted with a certainty that suggested no resistance, no effort. A darker distortion against an already dark sky, defined only by the faintest edge of light and that quiet red glow. It did nothing. That was the detail that settled deepest. It did not descend, it did not scan, it did not react, it simply remained. And somehow, that made its presence heavier. Maurice looked toward the figures along the terraces. No fear, no confusion, only something far more unsettling. Familiarity. The kind that comes not from first sight, but from long understanding. Maurice watched the stillness ripple through the terraces, through the figures, through the city itself, and understood something he had missed before. The city was not being watched. The city was participating. And in that moment, Maurice realized something he had not allowed himself to consider. This was not something visiting the city. This was something the city lived with. Chapter 17. The Warning from Beyond the Ice. The message was not delivered in words, not at first. It came through gesture, through repetition, through a slow, deliberate effort to bridge understanding without fully revealing anything that did not need to be revealed. One figure stepped forward again. Not closer, just clearer. A hand lifted toward the sky, toward the Watcher, then lowered slowly toward the chest, held there, still. The motion repeated, again, again, until its meaning became unavoidable. Keep it contained, keep it small, do not send it upward. Eventually, fragments of language or something close enough began to form between them, broken, incomplete, but intentional. Maurice understood only pieces. But the pieces were enough. Seen is not safe. Seen is signal. The figure's hand lifted again toward the sky. Signal is answered. The figure hesitated, then something changed. Not in movement, in tone. The next gestures were slower, heavier, as though repeating something long remembered, a division. One hand raised, open, the other closed. Then, the closed hand turned outward, pushed away, rejected. The open hand remained, held, protected. Maurice didn't understand the language. He understood the implications. Not all who came here belonged, and not all who belonged remained. There was no urgency in the delivery, no attempt to persuade, only clarity, as though the message had been given before, many times, and always too late. The figure held Maurice's gaze, then slowly shook its head. Not in refusal, in warning. Do not announce yourselves, do not call outward, do not mistake visibility for discovery, because in this place, those two things were not the same. And whatever existed above them did not arrive because it was invited. It arrived because something made itself known. Then, for the first time, The figure looked upward. Not in reverence, not in fear, in awareness. And slowly it stepped back. Not retreating, yielding. As though whatever moved above was not the same as what stood before them, and never had been. Chapter 18. The departure no one spoke about. By morning, the decision had already been made. Not discussed, not debated, understood. The crew prepared the ship in silence. Movements were efficient but subdued, as though even the action itself needed to remain controlled. No one wanted to test the rules of this place, not after understanding them. The figures along the terraces did not stop them, did not approach, did not signal farewell. They simply remained, watching, as they likely always would. Maurice stood at the edge of the deck before departure, looking back toward the city. For a brief moment, he considered staying, not out of curiosity, out of logic. Because if survival here required silence, then perhaps this was the only place left where survival was understood. But that thought passed, not because it was wrong, but because it was not his choice to make. The ship turned, slowly, deliberately, and as it began to return toward the passage, Maurice looked once more to the sky. The red glow was gone, or hidden, which he realized was worse, because it meant one thing had not changed. It was still there. It had simply chosen not to be seen. Chapter 19. The logbook no one could use. The return to known waters was immediate, too immediate, as though the world had been waiting just beyond the boundary, ready to resume its usual behavior the moment they crossed it. Wind returned, waves regained their motion, the sky corrected itself, the stars made sense again, everything behaved, everything aligned, everything pretended nothing had happened. But the crew did not return with it. Maurice wrote everything, carefully, precisely. The ice wall, the passage, the open sea, the city, the people, the watcher. He recorded coordinates that could not be verified, described skies that did not match any known chart, outlined structures that no map acknowledged. He wrote it all, and in doing so, made it unusable, because the more accurate the account became, the less believable it was. Some of the crew denied it, others refused to speak of it. A few asked him not to write at all, but Maurice continued, not to prove what he had seen, but because not recording it felt like the greater risk. And yet, even as he wrote, one understanding remained. This was not knowledge meant to be spread. It was knowledge meant to be carried, carefully, quietly, or not at all. Chapter 20. The final entry. Years passed, ports changed, ships came and went, the world grew louder, more connected, more certain of itself. Maurice aged within it, but never fully returned to it. Because once you understand something fundamental, you do not forget it, you adjust around it. Sometimes in quiet moments he would look south, not with longing, with awareness, knowing that beyond the distant horizon, the world did not end, it continued, but under different rules. In his final entry, there was no attempt to convince, no argument, no declaration, only observation, measured, controlled, and restrained in a way that suggested he finally understood the most important part of what he had been shown. He did not describe the city in detail. He did not describe the people. He barely described the watcher. Instead, he wrote this. He added one detail he had avoided until then, not because it was unclear, but because it was too clear, that the sky beyond the ice was not a sky in a way they understood it. It held, not like atmosphere, like structure, subtle, vast, curved beyond perception, but present in every alignment that refused to drift. Not a ceiling, not a boundary, but something that ensured everything beneath it remained where it was meant to be. That the world may be larger than we believe, older than we assume, and more observed than we are prepared to accept. Not by one presence, but by many, some distant, some embedded, and some so close to our understanding of form that we would mistake them for something familiar, if we ever saw them clearly. Then one final thought, not presented as truth, not even as certainty, but as something closer to caution. If the barrier of ice was placed to conceal a passage, then perhaps the passage was never meant to hide what lay beyond. Perhaps it was placed to ensure that what lies beyond does not need to come looking. Final reflection. And so, the story of Captain William Maurice remains, where all the difficult stories tend to live, not fully believed, not fully dismissed, suspended somewhere between memory and warning, Perhaps there was no voyage. Perhaps the ice holds nothing but cold and distance. Or perhaps, like many old accounts, it survived because it carried something more durable than proof, a pattern. Not the fear of monsters, not even the fear of the unknown, but the quieter thought that the unknown may already be aware of us. That beyond the last horizon, there are systems older than our maps, older than our questions, and built around a single understanding. That silence is not absence, it is strategy. And if Morris did cross that line, then what he brought back was not discovery, it was restraint. Because the most dangerous realization was never what he saw beyond the ice, but what might have followed him, simply by being seen. And if something out there is patient, then it doesn't need to search. It only needs to wait for something somewhere to make itself visible. For now, let the sea take the story back. Let the chart remain folded. Let the southern horizon return to myth. And if somewhere far beyond what we can measure, something patient is still watching, let it find nothing worth noticing. Because not everything reveals itself to be seen. Sometimes it's waiting to confirm that you can see it at all. Sleep well, and I'll meet you again at the edge of another map.